Hey everybody, it's Pastor Brian Ross from Grace Life Bible Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We want to welcome you to this midweek video. We appreciate you tuning in as always and being a part of our listening audience. If you haven't already done so, if you would consider subscribing and ringing the alarm bell here on YouTube as a way of staying current with the ministry when we go live from our assembly building on Sunday morning, as well as when we create content for you here midweek, we would certainly appreciate that. We also want to remind you about our Rumble channel here, Grace Life Bible Church on Rumble. We established this as an alt tech site should something happen to our YouTube ministry. So if you prefer Rumble or alternatives over YouTube, please consider checking us out here on Rumble as well. My featured book in this video is once again my book, Don't Pass Over Easter, A New Defense of Easter in Acts 12:4. This book defends the King James reading of Easter as not a mistake, but as accurate, but it does so possibly from a little bit different angle or lens than what has historically been the case within pro-King James argumentation. So if you like a different opinion on that or just want to check it out, please consider picking up a copy of Don't Pass Over Easter. We think that you'll enjoy that book. The reason I'm featuring Don't Pass Over Easter is because what we are doing this week is we are migrating content from Norman Normal 55's YouTube channel onto the Grace Life Bible Church YouTube channel. I originally taught the content for Don't Pass Over Easter in a 3-part series in the adult Sunday school class at Grace Life Bible Church in 2017 in the lead up to Easter that year. So we are taking the information and putting it on our YouTube channel and recording these previews featuring the book and encouraging people to check that out. The book, again, the content for the book was seeded by these 3 messages that was then edited and refined into what became the book. In part 3 of this series, I cover the scriptural exposition of Acts 12:4, as well as offer some concluding thoughts about the greater controversy and what I think is going on with the traditional King James only defense, as well as some of the critiques of the King James Bible in that reading. And so you're definitely going to want to check that out. So again, the video in this is a little bit dated. It's from 2017. I think it's definitely better than part 2. Part 2 had a technical snafu that we were able to sort of salvage. This one I think is cleaner and better, and none of it should distract you from being able to check out the content here. So please give this a listen. Appreciate you tuning in. And we're going to flip it over now to the 2017 recording of part 3 of Don't Pass Over Easter. Thanks for your attention, and I hope you enjoy the lesson.
Study because we had a technical problem and didn't get it adequately recorded as far as sound is concerned. So that's kind of why we're trying to readjust after having done that. So I appreciate your patience. We do need to get rolling though because I got a lot of material. So you should have in front of you a set of notes for Acts 12:4, Don't Pass Over Easter, Why Everything You Thought You Knew Was Wrong, Part 3. Okay? So, introduction. 2 weeks ago we began an investigation into whether or not Easter is an accurate translation of the Greek word Pascha in Acts 12:4 in the King James Bible. In each of the first 2 lessons we noted that critics of the King James in general, and King James onlyism specifically, have sought to use Acts 12:4 as a case in point to prove that the King James Bible is not inerrant. It is alleged by some that Easter is a mistranslation of the Greek word Pascha, and therefore constitutes an error in the King James Bible. In addition, we have noted that defenders of the inerrancy of the King James Bible sought to answer these critics and have put forth arguments defending why they believe Easter is not a mistake in Acts 12:4. So we've been looking at the following points, okay? In the first study, we looked at the first 3. We saw factual considerations about why the controversy, King James only defense of Easter in Acts 12, and then is Easter exclusively pagan? We covered those 2 points in lesson 1. In lesson 2, we spent the entire lesson looking at Easter in the English Bible, a brief look at the history of translation, and then the 5th point we need to cover today, which is a scriptural exposition of Acts 12:4, okay? So, now only point 5 remains to be considered. Before expounding upon point 5, a review of the highlights from lessons 1 and 2 is in order. In summation, we observe the following in the first 2 lessons. Number 1, the English word Easter is not related to the Semitic goddesses Ishtar and Astarte. This is a false etymological connection first made by Alexander Hislop in his 1853 book, The Two Babylons. And again, that's Hislop's book right here from 1853. He is the first one to make that allegation. Okay? Second, etymologically, Easter means dawn and originated with the Anglo-Saxon word ostre. Third, Easter was used by Anglo-Saxon Christians to refer to the morning of Christ's resurrection as dawn par excellence. 4. A form of Easter was used 26 times in the West Saxon Gospels of 990 and 1175 to refer to the Jewish feast day. We proved that to you last Sunday. Okay? 5. The Middle English Dictionary confirms that Easter was used during the 14th and 15th centuries, some 200 years before Tyndale coined the term Passover in 1530 to refer to the Jewish Passover. 6. William Tyndale translated Pascha as some form of Easter 26 times in his 1526 New Testament. This disproves the erroneous notion that Pascha never means Easter in English. In summation, in English, the Jewish feast day of Passover was known as Easter before the word Passover was even invented. Once coined in 1530, so I'm on point, 7 now, I think? Once coined in 1530, Passover did not immediately replace Easter as the preferred English translation of Pascha until the publication of the Geneva Bible in 1560. Coverdale's Old Testament, 1535, the Great Bible's New Testament, 1539, the Geneva New Testament of 1537, as well as the Bishop's New Testament in 1568, all use Easter and Passover interchangeably in the same context to refer to the Jewish feast. Proved that to you last Sunday. Okay? 8. According to Rule 1, given to the King James translators, the Bishop's Bible was to serve as the base text for their revision. The Bishop's Bible used Easter twice in John 11:55 and once in Acts 12:4 to describe the Jewish holy day. The translators elected to change 2 occurrences in John 11:55 to Passover, but elected to let Easter stand in Acts 12:4. And I think we're on 9. The Oxford English Dictionary defines Easter as Passover and uses Acts 12:4 as an example of that word usage. So that's all review from what we've seen in the first 2 studies. Okay? So having proved our case beyond reasonable historical doubt regarding the etymology and translational history of the English word Easter, all that remains is to demonstrate that Luke is referring to the Jewish feast in Acts 12:4. It is to this point that we will now turn our attention. Okay? So let's go to your Bible, look at Acts 12 and verse 1. Acts 12:1. Now about that time Herod the king stretched forth his hand to vex certain of the church. Okay? So look at your notes. What church is Herod seeking to vex here? Okay? In the context, Herod is not vexing the church, the body of Christ, but the Jewish kingdom church at Jerusalem, i.e. the little flock. Okay? Now how do you know that? Look at the next verse. And he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. So back to the notes for verse 2. Herod's vexation of the church in verse 1 takes the form of the execution of James, the brother of John, in verse 2. James was one of the 12 apostles chosen by Christ during his earthly ministry. Hold your hand there and go over to Matthew chapter 4. So in seeking to vex the church, he's going to kill James with the sword. James is explicitly identified in verse 2 as the brother of John. James and John are apostles that the Lord picked and chose during his earthly ministry. Matthew chapter 4, look with me at verse 21. It says, and going from thence he saw other 2 brethren, James the son of Zebedee and John his brother, in a ship with Zebedee their father, mending their nets, and called them. And immediately they left the ship and their father, and what? Followed him. Come over to Matthew 10. Come over to Matthew 10. So there's James and John, the sons of Zebedee. They are 2 of the 12 that the Lord chose during his earthly ministry. Matthew chapter 10, verse 1. It says, and when he had called unto him his 12 disciples. Notice in verse 1 he calls them what? Disciples. He gave them power against unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal all manner of sickness and all manner of disease. Now look at verse 2. And the names of the 12 what? Notice that they shift from being merely disciples to being what? Apostles, as they're given power there in verse 1. Then he identifies who they are. And the names of the 12 apostles are these. The first, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee, and John his what? Brother. Okay, go back to Acts 12. Who is Herod killing? How is he going to vex the church? In Acts chapter 12, verse 1, he's going to vex the church by killing who? James, the brother of John. Who is James, the brother of John? James was one of the 12 chosen by the Lord and commissioned to preach the gospel of the kingdom to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Okay? I actually had to turn back here too soon. Go grab Matthew 19 first. James, being one of the 12 apostles, is also one of these men who in the regeneration, in the kingdom, once the kingdom is established, is going to have authority in judging and reigning over the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay? Look with me at Matthew chapter 19, verse 27 it said, Then Peter answered and said unto him, Behold, we have forsaken all and followed thee. What shall we have therefore? And Jesus said unto them, that's the 12 that he's talking to in the context, Verily I say unto you, that ye which have followed me in the regeneration, when the Son of Man shall sit on the throne of his glory, ye also shall sit upon how many thrones? 12, judging who? Okay, well, who's he talking to there? He's talking to the 12 apostles, right? Who was one of those 12 apostles? James, the son of who? Zebedee, the brother of John. Okay, go back to Acts 12. So as an apostle to the little flock, James was promised by Christ that he would sit on a throne in the kingdom and judge Israel. So the context of Acts 12 is referring to some things that are happening in Jerusalem as they pertain to that little flock, that Jewish kingdom church that was established there. Now, so verse 1, Now about that time Herod the king stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church, and he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. Now look at verse 3. And because he saw it pleased the Jews.
Who?
Okay, so the death of James makes who happy?
Jews.
The Jews.
The leadership, probably.
The leadership of what nation?
Israel.
Israel. So, now because he saw it pleased the Jews, so Herod observes that his execution of James makes who happy? The Jews. So when he observes that, he is then going to move to take who? Peter. Look at the rest of verse 3. And because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter what? Also. And then you have in parentheses, then were the days of what? Unleavened bread. So let's go back to the notes. For verse 3. When Herod saw that the death of James in verse 1 pleased the Jews, i.e. the apostate religious leadership of Israel, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. The leadership of Israel had long been plotting how they might punish the little flock and its leadership. Come back to Acts 4. Acts 4, verse 17. But that it was spread no further among the people, let us straitly threaten them. So this is the Jewish leadership at Jerusalem in the previous verse, okay, devising how they could threaten who? These apostles, these members of the little flock here, right? Verse 17. But that it spread no further among the people, let us straitly threaten them, that they speak henceforth to no man in this name. And they called unto them, and they called them, and commanded them that they should not speak at all, nor teach in the name of Jesus. But when Peter and John answered and said unto them, now this John is the brother of who? James that was just killed, right? And so here's the leadership talking to Peter and who? and John, right? I lost my spot. 19. But when Peter and John answered and said unto them, whether it be right in the sight of God to hearken unto you more than unto God, judge ye. But we cannot but speak the things which we have seen and heard. So when they had further threatened them, they let them go, finding nothing how they might punish them, because of who? The people. For all men glorified God for what was done. For the man was above 40 years old, of whom the miracle of healing was showed. So are they threatening them there and trying to shut them up from their testimony? Okay, come on to chapter 5. Look at verse 17. Acts 5:17. Then the high priest rose up, and all they that were with him, which is the sect of the Sadducees, and were filled with indignation, and they laid their hands on who? The apostles, and put them in where? And put them in the common prison. But the angel of the Lord by night opened the prison doors and brought them forth. So in chapter 4, do they threaten them? In chapter 5, do they actually arrest them and put them in prison, right? Then the angel does the jailbreak there in that passage, right? You're in chapter 5, drop down to verse 40. And to him they alleged, and when they had called the apostles and beaten them, they commanded them that they should not speak in the name of Jesus, and did what? So they threaten them, they throw them in prison, then they what? Then they beat them. So as the leadership of Israel have been trying to deal with this Peter problem, this little flock problem for a while here within the context of the book of Acts, okay? You know about Acts 7. We're not going to read all Acts 7. That's the trial of Stephen. Stephen, a member of this little flock, is brought forth, and he is ultimately stoned by the Jewish leadership. Come to Acts 9. Acts 9, and Saul, yet breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord, went unto the high priest, and desired of him letters to Damascus, that if he found any of this way, whether they were men or women, that he might bring them bound unto where? Unto Jerusalem, right? So, once the persecution, for the sake of time, go back to chapter 8. I mentioned this verse in a minute, so we'll just read it now. Acts 8 verse 1, and Saul was consenting unto his death, and at the time there was a great persecution against the church, which was where? At Jerusalem, and they were all scattered abroad throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except who? So who's hanging out in Jerusalem by the time you get to chapter 12? The apostles. The rest of everybody has what? Left town, right? And the way you know that is, does Paul need to get letters from the high council to go to Damascus to bring him back bound to Jerusalem? Okay? So when you get to chapter 12, the leadership of Israel has been dealing with a little flock problem here, and Peter and the boys, for at least since chapter 4. Okay? So, go back to chapter 12, verse 3. And because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter. Then were the days of unleavened bread. So, the Jews were pleased with Herod's action in arresting Peter because they had been endeavoring to take care of their little flock problem for some time. Luke is very clear in verse 3 about when Herod arrested Peter. The parenthesis tells us that it was during the days of what? Unleavened bread. Okay, now go to verse 4. And when he had apprehended him, that is Herod apprehending who? Peter. And when he had apprehended him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to who? The people. Okay? So Herod apprehends Peter in verse 4 to please the Jews in verse 3. And he kept him in prison, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people. What people? What people is he trying to please? He's trying to please the Jewish leadership in verse 3. Okay? So, the people that he's trying to please are the Jews in verse 3, who were happy that Peter had been what? Arrested. Is everybody following what's going on here? Okay? So, mark well. Please, mark well that these verses say nothing about Herod keeping or observing anything. much less the pagan spring festival of Easter as defined by Hislop. All Herod's doing is arresting who? And he's keeping him until prison, until after Easter, to bring him forth unto the people that he's trying to please by having arrested him in the first place. Okay? The people observing something in the context are the Jews whom Herod is aiming to please by arresting Peter. What were the Jews observing at this time? The days of unleavened bread, as verse 3 clearly asserts, or attests, excuse me, whatever, same difference. The most natural reading of these verses is that Herod elected to hold Peter until after the conclusion of the feast that the Jews were what? Herod is not observing anything here. The text never says that. Okay? Now, look at the next point. We have already proven beyond doubt that Easter was a synonym for Passover in English. We did that last Sunday. Therefore, the most natural reading of Acts 12, 3 and 4 is that Herod would bring Peter forth unto the people after the conclusion of Easter / what? Passover. Okay? Now, recall from lesson 1 that Dr. Samuel C. Gipp, so that's the answer book right here again, okay? That Dr. Samuel C. Gipp states the following in question 2 of the answer book regarding the meaning of the English word Easter as well as the timing of Passover and the days of unleavened bread in Acts 12. He said, remember, that Easter is an ancient pagan holiday connected with the worship of the goddess Astarte and Ishtar. Where did Gipp get that idea from? He got that idea from who? From Hislop and the two Babylons. Okay, that's where he got the idea from. Look at top page 4. Second, Gibb said that Passover occurred on the 14th of the month and that no event after the 14th is ever referred to as Passover. So I have this line. This is Gibb's view drawn on the board. Okay? He says the 14th is what? Passover. That no day after the 14th is ever referred to as what? Passover. Not to get too far ahead of myself. Next point. The days of unleavened bread began on the 15th of the month, the day after Passover. So Gibb says the 14th is Passover, the 15th is the first day of what? Unleavened bread, and no day after the 14th is ever referred to as what? Passover, right? It's anything 15th on, according to Gibb, is always referred to as what? Unleavened bread. Excuse me. So the days of unleavened bread are always after Passover and never referred to as Passover, according to Gibb. Okay? Peter was arrested during the days of unleavened bread, which is after what? Passover. Again, reminding you of Gibb's view here. Therefore, Herod could not possibly have been referring to Passover in Acts 12:4. The next Passover was a year what? Away. So, understand the construct. So, in Gibb's mind, what day is Passover?
14.
That's the only day that's ever referred to as Passover, right? So, if Herod arrests Peter in verse 3 during the days of unleavened bread, then when's the next Passover? Come around a whole calendar year. Right? Because he's saying that no day after the 14th is ever referred to as what? Passover. Okay? So therefore, okay, I already said that, Herod was a pagan Roman who worshipped the Queen of Heaven and had no reason to keep the Jewish Passover. Herod did not kill Peter during the days of unleavened bread because he wanted to wait until later in the month after the passing of his own holiday, what? Easter. So what I have drawn up for you is the way Gibb explains it. Okay, now we went over that in detail in lesson 1. So, per Gibb, Luke could not have been referring to the Jewish Passover in Luke 12:4 because Peter was arrested during the days of unleavened bread, which were after Passover, from the 15th till the 21st.
Did you mean Acts?
What did I say?
Acts.
That should say Acts, yes. Acts 24, yeah. Let me read that again. That's a pretty important point. So, per Dr. Gibb, Luke could not have been referring to the Jewish Passover in Acts 12:4, because Peter was arrested during the days of unleavened bread, which was after Passover, from the 15th to the 21st. According to Dr. Gibb, no day after the 14th is ever referred to as what? Passover. Now, we don't have time to stop for questions now, but I just needed some affirmation that you're at least following what Gibb is saying here. Nodding of the head, a thumbs up, oh, that a boy, keep going, preaching, brother.
Here, give it to him, man.
Okay. So, at no point in his discussion of Easter in Acts 12:4 did Gibb make mention of Ezekiel 45:21, Matthew 26:17 through 18, and Luke 22:1 in terms of how these verses include / connect the days of unleavened bread with Passover. Now understand, has Gibb inextricably separated Passover from the days of unleavened bread?
Yep.
Okay? And he doesn't mention the 3 verses that we're going to look at next. Okay? Because he says that no day after the 14th is ever referred to as what? Passover. He says Peter's arrested during the days of unleavened bread, so the next Passover is what? A year away. So everybody's with all that, right? So look at, I gave you these verses for the sake of time. Ezekiel 45:21. Okay? In the first month, in the 14th day of the month, what would that be? Okay? In the 14th day of the month, ye shall have the Passover. A feast of what? 7 days, unleavened bread shall be what? Uh-oh. What did Ezekiel 45 just do? It connected all of this and called the whole thing what?
A feast.
A feast. The Passover what? Feast. Ezekiel just connected the 14th with the entire days of unleavened bread and called it what? Passover. Okay? Gibb does not mention this verse. You think that's a relevant point?
Yeah.
Okay? So look at my comment under the verse. This verse clearly states that Passover was a feast of 7 days that began on the 14th of the month, during which unleavened bread was what? Eaten. Okay? This one's Matthew 26:17, verse 17 and 18. Now look at this, verse 17. Now the first day of the feast of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying unto him, Where wilt thou that we prepare for thee to eat the what? Wait a minute. They asked, hey, it's the first day of unleavened bread, are we going to eat what? The Passover. And Jesus said, wait a minute here, guys, you're wrong. Only the 14th is the Passover. Unleavened bread is the 15th through the 21st, right? Verse 18. And he said, Go into the city to such a man, and say unto him, The master saith, My time is at hand, I will keep what? So Jesus is going to keep the Passover on the first day of what?
Unleavened bread.
Is that a problem for Gibb?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, so here's my commentary on that. In verse 17, the apostles approached Jesus about eating the Passover on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. According to Gibb's exposition in the answer book, this practice on the part of the apostles runs contrary to Old Testament practice. Adding insult to injury, Jesus does not rebuke or correct the apostles' false chronology, but agrees to eat the Passover with the disciples on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread in verse 18. By doing so, Christ is violating the Old Testament, that should say Scriptures. Christ is violating the Old Testament Scriptures according to Gibb's explanation. If Gibb's explanation is correct, then is Jesus violating the distinction that he's established here? Because he's eating Passover on the first day of what? Unleavened bread, and these two things are never what? Never the same, according to the way Gipp explained it. Okay? Furthermore, why does Gipp not mention this connection between Passover and the days of unleavened bread in Matthew 17 and 18, when he is clearly aware of the passage, as we will demonstrate shortly? The cheese gets a lot more binding for Gipp, because I'm going to demonstrate to you shortly that he knows these two verses are there, and he uses them to make a different point later on in his exposition. But he says nothing about the connection between Passover and the days of unleavened bread. The third verse is Luke 22:1. Now the feast of unleavened bread drew nigh, which is called what?
The Passover.
Hello? Okay? So Luke, the same person that wrote Acts 12:4, explicitly states in Luke 22:1 that the Feast of Unleavened Bread was called what? In Luke's mind, this whole thing is called what?
Passover.
Passover. Is everybody with that? So, these verses explain why Luke included the parentheses about the days of unleavened bread at the end of Acts 12:3, i.e. to help the reader identify the timing of Peter's arrest by Herod. As the second part of a two-part treatise addressed to Theophilus, the connection between Luke 22:1 and Luke 12:3-4 would have been clear to Theophilus. Luke is clearly reporting that Peter was arrested by Herod during the Jewish Paschal or Passover week, as identified by Ezekiel 45:21, Matthew 26:17-18, and Luke chapter 22, verse 1. Because he sought to please who? The Jews in Acts 12:3. Herod elected to hold Peter until after the Passover or Easter, when properly defined, before bringing him forth to who? To the people. Last week, I handed out this chart. This is just an aside point that I find absolutely fascinating. I gave you the Old Testament. You will notice that the last place that Easter in the Old Testament remained Easter before it was changed to Passover was Ezekiel 45:21. Isn't that interesting? Because Ezekiel 45:21 clearly establishes that Passover and unleavened bread were used to refer to the same one. To the same feast. Okay? Now, in summation, the context of Acts 12 is thoroughly Jewish, and the English word Easter has a long history of being used as a reference to the Jewish feast. The King James translators use Easter in Acts 12:4 to refer to the Jewish feast. This is the simplest, most biblical, and most charitable answer to the alleged controversy. When they say Easter, they are referring to what? Passover. Now, again, the Oxford English Dictionary confirms this by providing Acts 12:4 from the King James Bible as an example of the second definition of Easter equaling the Passover in English. And again, I've given you the appendix again for your edification. So, Easter in Acts 12:4, the King James Bible, means Passover. The King James Bible is not in error with this rendering, nor is it a mistranslation of the Greek word Pascha. It is a perfectly acceptable English way of referring to the Jewish feast as attested by the entomological and translational evidence. Now here's an important point. Uniformity of phrasing was not a demand placed upon the text by the King James translators. Okay? According to the preface, the King James translators did not employ a principle of rigidity when taking words from the donor language, Hebrew and Greek, and rendering them in the receptor language, English, which means in the minds of the translators, there are multiple acceptable ways of saying what? the same thing. And here's their quote on that, okay? Another thing we think good to admonish thee of, gentle reader, is that we have not tied ourselves to an uniformity of phrasing, or to an identify of words. I have to check that. That doesn't sound right. And as some peradventure would wish we had done. Do they know that what they did is going to make some people mad? Did they do it anyway? Okay. Why did they do it? Because they observe that some learned men somewhere have been as exact as they could that way. Truly, that we might not vary from the sense of that which we have translated, if the words signaled in the same in both places, for there be words that be not the same sense everywhere, they say, we were especially careful and made a conscience according to our duty, but that we should express the same notion in the same particular word, as for example, if we translate the Hebrew or Greek word as one's purpose, never to call it intent, or if one were journeying, never traveling, or if one were think, never suppose, or if one were pain, never ache, if one were joy, never gladness, if one were Passover, never Easter. Okay? Thus to mince the matter, we thought the savor more of curiosity than wisdom, and that rather it would breed the scorn in the atheist to bring profit to the goodly reader. For is the kingdom of God to become words or syllables, we should be in bondage to them, if we may be free, use one precisely, when we may use another no less fit. What are they saying? They are anticipating the exact allegation. They are anticipating the exact allegation that Pascha always means what? Passover. Well, it does always mean Passover, but there's another word in English to express that exact meaning, and it was what? Easter. And they chose to leave it in the text in Acts 12:4. And they tell you why they did it right there. Okay? So, in other words, as long as an English word fits the sense of the Hebrew or Greek in a given passage, the King James translators did not lock themselves into rendering a given word from the donor language with the same word in the receptor language every time. This was done on purpose by the translators, so as to enrich the translation, despite their knowledge that some would take issue with the practice. Such is the case with how the translators chose to handle the Greek word Pascha. Either Easter or Passover were well suited for conveying the idea of the Jewish feast in what? In English. Okay? Now, so, this ought to leave questions in your mind about how did they get this thing so wrong? Okay? So how did get it so wrong? In the end, the King James Bible is correct in Acts 12:4, but not for the reasons identified by Gibb, or those espoused by any other King James only advocate I have ever encountered. As stated in Lesson 1, most King James advocates offer some form of the Gibb argument presented in the answer book for why Easter is correct in Acts 12:4. Essentially, Gibb and those who argue similarly make mistakes in each one of the following three categories: definitional, scriptural, and theological. Okay, so let's look at each one of those three. Definitional. The mistake here is found in substituting Hislop's false etymology regarding Ishtar, Astarte, for the true etymology set forth in the Oxford English Dictionary, Online Etymological Dictionary, and the Middle English Dictionary. Moreover, Dr. Gibb makes no attempt to discuss the pre-1611 translational history of the word Easter in the English Bible. Okay? So the problem is he's getting his definition from who? From Hislop. That is the first mistake. Okay? Mistake number 2, scriptural. Dr. Gibb fails to compare Scripture with Scripture when he tells his readers that no other day other than the 14th is ever referred to as Passover. This is completely false, as demonstrated by Ezekiel 45:21 and Luke 22:1, verses that Dr. Gibb conveniently left out of his explanation. Why did Dr. Gibb leave these verses out of his explanation? Now listen, if he knows and he tells you that it's there 29 times, does he know how to use a concordance? Okay? So he's leaving information out on purpose. Okay? Why? The answer is because he must. In this way we see the tension between the Scriptures and the false entomology created by Hislop and embraced by Dr. Gibb. In an effort to explain why the King James Bible is not mistaken in its use of Easter in Acts 12:4, as Dr. Gibb has defined the term, he must overlook Ezekiel 45:21 and Luke 22:1 because they do not fit the paradigm he is seeking to advance. Okay? If Passover is ever used to refer to anything beyond the 14th, or could be proven to include the days of unleavened bread, which begin on the 15th and end on the 21st, then the modern versions would be right, and the King James wrong, according to the way Dr. Gibb has structured his argument. You see what's going on here? Okay? So recall from lesson 1 that he admits as much in the answer book. Now I'm just going to read the bold. Well, we've got to read the whole thing. He says, even though the Jewish Passover was held in mid-April, the 14th, and the pagan festival of Easter was held later the same month, how do we know that Herod was referring to Easter in Acts 12:4 and not the Jewish Passover? Now watch what he says. He says, if he was referring to the Passover, the translation of Pascha as Easter is incorrect. What did I just prove to you? That he is referring to what? The Jewish Passover. That Luke is referring to the Jewish Passover. So if he's referring to the Passover, the translation of Pascha as Easter is incorrect. If he was indeed referring to the pagan holiday, or holy day, Easter, then the King James Bible 1611 must truly be the very words of God, for it is the only Bible in print today which has the correct reading. So what's he doing? I got him? Okay. Before moving off this point, a further observation regarding Dr. Gibb's exposition is in order. Above we noted that Dr. Gibb failed to note the connection between Passover and the days of unleavened bread in Matthew 26, 17, and 18. This oversight on Gibb's part is curious given the fact that he clearly references Matthew 26, 17 through 19 on 2 different occasions in his explanation for why Easter is not a mistake in the King James Bible in the answer book. Twice on page 8, Dr. Gibb uses Matthew 26, 17 through 18 to support an alternative point that the Jews, about the Jews not being adverse to killing Christ during the Passover. Now look at, he said, we're just going to read the first one and I'll point out the second one. Second, he could not have been waiting until after Passover because he thought the Jews would not kill a man during a religious holiday. They had killed Jesus during the Passover, and then what verses does he give? He gives you 2 verses that that connect Passover with what? So in the very point he's trying to make, he's giving you verses that contradict his point. Okay? Now you can see the other one there later on down. I want to go to the next point for the sake of time. From this we observe that Dr. Gibb referenced a passage, Matthew 26, 17 through 18, that contradicts the point he is endeavoring to make in the very paragraph in which he referenced it. Therefore, we conclude that Dr. Gibb knows how to use a concordance and was very aware of verses such as Matthew 45:21, or excuse me, Ezekiel 45:21, Matthew 26, 17 through 18, and Luke 22:1, but chose to ignore them in his exposition because they did not fit the doctrinal paradigm he was seeking to advance. So there's a definitional problem, there's a scriptural problem. Okay? Third is a theological problem. Dr. Gibb's exposition is theologically confused. At one point, he offers the following reason for why Herod could not have waited until after Passover to release Peter. He says on page 8, Peter was no longer considered a Jew. He had repudiated Judaism. The Jews would have no reason to be upset by Herod's actions. Really? Is this a dispensationally accurate statement?
No.
Had Peter, the leader of the little flock, repudiated Judaism? Okay. Did we not observe above that Peter and the other apostles were laboring during the early Acts period to save their kinsmen according to the flesh? It was Peter and the apostles who stayed in Jerusalem when the persecution broke out following the death of Stephen. Acts 8:1, we read that earlier. The bottom line here is this. Gipp's assessment of what is going on in Acts 12 is based at least in part on a faulty dispensational theology. Peter agrees to limit his ministry at the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 to the circumcision, after Gipp says that Peter had repudiated Judaism as of Acts 12. Folks, I'm sorry, okay? No mid-Acts Pauline dispensationalist has any response, can repeat Gipp's explanation in any way, shape, manner, or form and have any credibility. Because it is completely wrong. It's completely wrong. It's wrong in its definitions, it's wrong in its scriptural approach, it's wrong in its theological approach. Okay? Gipp is showing you where he is coming from here in his exposition. Okay? So, in this way, wait a minute, where am I at? Am I on furthermore? Furthermore, in the context of Acts 12, the Jews had not asked Peter to do anything. The Jews had not asked Herod to do anything with respect to Peter. Herod did that on his own when he saw how happy they were at his actions toward James in verse 1. The circumstances were completely different in Acts 12 than they were in Matthew 26 when the Jews demanded the execution of Jesus. Rather than create a scene by executing Peter during the Jewish feast of unleavened bread / Passover, Herod elected to wait until after the Paschal week was over. Why? Because he would have upset the very people that he was trying to what? Please. Hello. In this way, we see that a matrix of poor definitional, scriptural, and theological thinking caused Gipp to misidentify the events, I should say Acts 12:4, or Acts 12. Okay? Again, just cruising through this. Again, we don't have time to stop for questions, but does everybody understand the fundamental things here that I'm pointing out here?
Yeah.
Okay? I am being very hard on Gipp here. I admit it. Okay, and I'm not going to apologize for it, because here's a guy who's trying to advance the King James Bible as inerrant based upon some pretty bad study. Okay? I think it's right ultimately, but his reason for why it's right is completely wrong and off base. It's off base definitionally, scripturally, and theologically. Okay? Now, there's another view out there, the Christian view of Passover. Other more informed defenders of the King James Bible have advanced a different argument than the one enunciated by Dr. Gibb. These folks have broken free from the false etymology advanced by Hislop and realized that historically Easter was used to refer to both the Christian festival and the Jewish feast day. These believers therefore reject the traditional King James Version only defense of Easter in Acts 12:4 on pagan grounds, and instead argue that Luke was referencing a Christian celebration as opposed to a pagan or Jewish one. The King James Bible Today article, Easter Passover in Acts 12:4, is emblematic of this approach, as is the YouTube video titled, Why We Should Not Pass Over Easter. No, I got my title before I saw this video. Okay? So I thought of it before I saw that, and then I'm like, ooh, that's pretty similar. But anyway, this position is justified on the grounds that the King James translators rendered Pascha as Easter only one time in Acts 12:4 after the resurrection. In contrast, before the resurrection, or in clear references to the Jewish feast, as in 1 Corinthians 5:7 and Hebrews 11:28, the translators used Passover exclusively. Therefore, those holding this view maintain that the King James translators reserved Passover for references to maintain that the King James translators reserve Passover for references to the Jewish holy day and confine Easter to the post-resurrection Christian festival. It is believed by those holding this view that this practice on the part of the King James translators served to settle the use of this terminology for the English language. In other words, from 1611 onward, Passover would be confined to meaning and usage to the Jewish festival, whereas Easter would apply exclusively to the Christian commemoration of the resurrection. There's probably a little bit of truth in that, and that did happen that way over time. I don't think, though, that that's what the translators were attempting to do when they were doing their work. Okay? So, while this view is an improvement over the pagan view advanced by Dr. Gipp and others, it still falls short for the following reasons. First, it ignores the clear Jewish context of Acts 12 outlined above. Third, it does not take into account the clear cross-references connecting the days of unleavened bread with the Jewish Passover. Second. That was second. What did I say?
You missed second.
Okay, I'm on three. Third, it makes the dispensational assumption that Peter, James, and John and their followers in Jerusalem were automatically Christians after the resurrection, in the sense that they were no longer following the Mosaic law or Israel's holy days outlined therein. Fourth, the producer of the YouTube video, Why We Should Not Pass Over Easter, quotes the Oxford English Dictionary at the end of his video to prove that Easter could refer to the Jewish Passover, but then fails to mention that Acts 12:4 is used in the very same dictionary as an example of the Jewish Passover. Okay? So given the totality of the evidence, the conclusion that Easter in Acts 12:4 is a reference to the Jewish feast of Passover is the soundest conclusion that one can arrive at. Okay? Now, my final thoughts. And I have 8 minutes. Final thoughts. While we have been very critical of Dr. Gibb in these lessons, we cannot let James R. White off the hook either. Recall from lesson 1 that White accepted the notion that Easter was pagan in origin and used it to argue that Easter was a mistranslation of Pascha in Acts 12:4. If Dr. White had adequately done his homework, he would have known that etymologically Easter was a perfectly acceptable way of rendering or of referring to the Jewish Passover. Moreover, he would have observed the long history of translating the Greek word Pascha as Easter in English prior to 1611. These observations regarding the suspect scholarship of Dr. White on this point highlight an important overall takeaway. The anti-King James / modern version side of the textual version debate does not have the market cornered in terms of scholarship, as many have falsely assumed. Both sides have fallen prey to the notion that preservation requires verbatim identicality of wording, which has led them to advance unscriptural notions regarding the doctrine of preservation. One side confines inspiration and inerrancy to the non-existent original autographs as a means of accounting for variant readings. Meanwhile, the other side ignores the existence of variant readings and insists upon perfect or verbatim preservation by faith for faith's sake. In this way, the debate regarding Easter in Acts 12:4 is a microcosm of the greater textual version debate. King James only advocates such as Dr. Gitt claim that the King James Bible is inerrant. This invites modern version advocates such as Dr. White to prove that the King James Version is not inerrant. Thus, we have the current controversy regarding Easter in Acts 12:4 in the King James Bible. As soon as a King James advocate says it's perfect, then that just is going to elicit people to say, no it's not, look here, 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 and here. Okay? Now, as soon as they say, no it's not, look here, here, and here, and here, what verse comes up?
Acts 12:4.
Acts 12:4, right? Now, what's Gibbs' response? Gibbs' response is, I got to have an explanation for why that has to be what? Easter. Why it could never be what? So when he does that, is he trying to defend verbatim identicality? So let's look at the next point. Meanwhile, confined by the standard of verbatim identicality for perfect preservation, Dr. Gipp endeavors to defend why the only correct reading of Pascha in Acts 12:4 is Easter. For him, it's never even a question based upon, what was the term I used earlier? Hang on. I'll find it, don't worry. Okay. Oh, uniformity of phrasing, that's what the translators use, right? Gipp never even entertains the idea that in Acts 12:4 that couldn't be anything other than what? Easter. It has to be what? So now what we got to do is we got to come up with an explanation for why it's what? Easter. I already showed you the tension that he has in his mind in a previous point. Okay? So, in the mind of Dr. Gipp, there is no possible way that Luke is talking about Passover in Acts 12, or God would have providentially caused the translators to use that word. Boy, that's getting real close to a second inspiration view.
Yeah, they mysteriously left that out in their explanation, any feeling of being led.
Who did?
The translators.
Yeah, the translators never said that.
Yes.
They said, we made this choice. Therefore he proceeds to erect a justification for that exact word. This is done without even considering that there might be a different way of saying the same thing. In this way, Gibbs' preconceptions limit the scope of his research before he has even commenced his investigation. Now, I know I'm getting real technical and logical here. Hopefully you're following that. This explains why he ignores the clear cross-references in Ezekiel 45:21, Matthew 26, and Luke 22. His explanatory model does not know how to account for those verses. Because if he allows for a second for Passover and the days of unleavened bread for Passover to refer the entire time, now he's got a problem with what? That. And he's already decided that means what? Pagan, Astarte, Ishtar, and all that stuff, right? So, because he's already decided that, he takes that idea to the text, and he only is going to talk about those verses that prove what he thinks based upon the preconception. Now, all of this highlights the need that King James Bible believers, all this highlights the need that King James Bible believers must go the extra mile in their study of the King James Bible. Those who adopt a pro-King James stance will often cite the King James Bible's archaic forms and manners of speaking as being more precise than modern English in their ability to convey biblical truth. While I wholeheartedly agree with this notion, it also mandates that additional study is in order to understand what the words meant, or what words meant in the early 17th century when the translation was made. Too often, King James advocates ascribe modern usage and meaning to words that did not necessarily mean the same thing in the early 17th century. Is everybody following that? Okay? This study of Easter stands out as a case in point. Modern readers are completely unaware that Easter had a long history of being used as a reference to the Jewish Passover. It was only by looking at pre-1611 English translations as well as etymological dictionaries that a clear understanding emerged. Consider the illustration of the United States Constitution. I am not saying that the Constitution was inspired. I'm just using this as an illustration. I'm not a Mormon. Okay? Written in the late 18th century, the Constitution, like the King James Bible, contains some archaic language. In our day, people argue about the nature of the Constitution. Strict constructionists view the Constitution as a fixed, static document that means what it says, whereas loose constructionists view the Constitution as a fluid document that is subject to societal and cultural interpretation. In order to understand the nature of what is being said, strict constructionists will appeal to what words meant in the late 1700s when the Constitution was drafted as justification for their strict interpretation. Moreover, the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers are viewed as commentaries on the original intent of America's founders and framers. Strict constructionists will appeal to these sources in order to establish original intent or what the Constitution meant at the time of its drafting. Is everybody following that illustration so far? Okay? By comparison, King James advocates need to be concerned with the original intent of the translators in terms of how they understood and used certain words. Consequently, a willingness to go the extra mile in terms of research is occasionally in order on the part of King James advocates to make sure their understanding of a particular English word corresponds with how the translators understood/used that particular word. Just as the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers, in addition to dictionaries from the time period, aid in establishing the original intent of the Constitution, entomological and early 17th century dictionaries, as well as pre-1611 English translations of the Textus Receptus, aid in establishing the meaning of English words in the early 1600s. Sometimes, as in the case of Easter, King James advocates need to be willing to go the extra mile in their study in order to arrive at sound conclusions. We are right on the meter.
Get into it.
So next Sunday, we will not have class. We're going to have our Easter breakfast. We're going to have here at the church. The men will come and cook breakfast, and everyone is invited. We encourage you to invite your family and friends out to that. We do have to quit. I got to clean up all this stuff and get ready for church. If you have any questions or comments, obviously talk to me after the fact. But thanks for your attention.